Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I don't really get any feedback on these webinars, but if you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll either try and answer them as we go along or I will save them up to the end. Any issues, just pop them in there. So this is a quick sort of 15 to 20 minute dive into the DfE 6 core digital standards for schools and colleges. Some context around those and what we need to be doing as schools and academies to move in the right direction for that compliance by 2030, which the DfE have set for us. Back in 2022, the DfE launched a whole host of digital standards for schools and colleges. And if you were a primary school or a college, those were the same standard almost and not really fit for purpose all the time. So they've been very much overlooked or put on the back burner. And what happened in the summer of 2025, for the first time, the DfE included 6 of those standards in their Academies handbook and have set the expectation that those should be met, must be met by 2030. And the idea being that IT and technology already runs through schools and academies, but what often isn't in place is that strategy and guidance around it to make sure that it's safe and fit for purpose and continues to be so. So I'm just going to go through a dive into the standards themselves, and hopefully it kind of makes sense on a bit of a journey. So the 6 standards that we're to talk about are broadband and internet, network switching, wireless network, cybersecurity, filtering and monitoring, and digital leadership and governance. And if we follow those through in an order, it does kind of make a bit of sense, hopefully. So first standard being broadband and internet. Without broadband and internet in your school, it's difficult for you to deliver any teaching these days, for your office functions to run and for senior leaders to run at mat level. And so what the DfE have set out is that you should have fast, super fast broadband. It should be resilient or backed up in some way, shape or form. And it should never be running at capacity, as well as obviously being secure. So what we're talking about there is the different technologies that are becoming available. Historically, the broadband technology available to schools was quite expensive, but as more alternative networks such as Leela Connect or Giga Connect in Derbyshire are coming online, that's naturally increasing competition, and so BT and other providers have upped their game as well. So what would have cost schools somewhere around £300 to £400 a month for a super fast fibre optic connection without any filtering and monitoring is now coming down into that sort of £60 to £70 a month bracket without the filtering and monitoring, and becoming more and more widely available. What we also need to think about there is the resilience of said connection. So if you've got a BT connection into your premises, it doesn't make sense to have a BT backup line. We need to think about whether we can get a Virgin Media or whether we go to a SIM card with a different provider, but making sure that in some level your school can tick over in the event that your main backup line goes down. Now, as governors and leaders, you might decide that it's appropriate that just the office function and the senior leaders can tick from a safeguarding point of view, or you might want that connection to be a little bit faster so that it allows teachers, or it might need to be a like for like and therefore be fast enough for staff, students and office to function as well. Those are just decisions that need to be made, but that's the connection that comes into your building that is obviously key to delivering an excellent education for your students and keeping them safe at the same time. And what that builds into and what that connects into when it enters your building is your network switching. So you might know these as your spaghetti cabinets around school. They are long, thin devices with lots and lots of wires coming out of them, and they take the connection from your broadband and feed it round to all the different devices in your school. So your PCs, your phones, your CCTV, possibly printers. It links everything together. So the DfE have rightly highlighted that these are a bit of a security issue in many schools, particularly primaries, where they just run on flat networks and there's no separation of traffic. So you'll have staff and students running on the same network as the CCTV and the printers. And equally, those devices often just get shoved into a cabinet and forgotten about. So what the DfE have come up with here is that needs to be cloud monitored or some sort of central management of the switches. It needs to be updated frequently. So all manufacturers will produce what's called firmware updates for those devices, and those need to be applied regularly. Now, when a device reaches a certain age, the manufacturers will stop providing those updates, and therefore it needs to be replaced, otherwise it becomes insecure, and that we need to implement some segregation of traffic on your network. So we'd have a student network, a guest network, a staff network, possibly a security network. So for example, CCTVs, door access controls, and then one for sort of Internet of Things like printers, those kind of things. So naturally built on from your broadband is your network switching. And then what most people think about when they think about networks is the wireless. So you get your iPad in your hand and you join the wireless and you're on the internet. But if at that point you've missed out those two previous steps that we've already talked about. So the wireless network has to be complete site coverage. So if you've got a learning space outside on your playground, then that needs coverage. If you've got a little corner that you take children off to for interventions, that needs to have coverage. This is part of delivering an excellent education, but also keeping safeguarding front of mind. If you've got an evacuation system or use Arbor for your registration, for example, if you've got Wi-Fi coverage on your playground, you can then in theory do a roll call whilst you're out for fire evacuation. But what often happens here is that schools have, again, the flat network structure that we've talked about with network switching, and the Wi-Fi keys probably on a whiteboard in a staff room or an office quite often. And the DfE say no to that these anymore, and that needs to be devices need to be enrolled onto the network with a secure key. So if that device is not known to your network, it can't join. And whether you're sat in the office and you're trying to give them wireless keys or get them on in another way, it's not going to work moving forward. We need to put a procedure in place to manage that, so that if you do get guests on site, how do they get network access? Well, that's something that just needs factoring into this. Now, also on wireless, a lot of schools in the Stoke City area benefited from Connect the Classroom, which was a great initiative. At the time, in my opinion, the devices and the kit is a little bit overspec'd for the needs of the schools. And what that's left you with is a sort of half upgraded network, because they only covered the bits that touch wireless. And it's left you with the rest of the core network to upgrade yourselves. And what you'll find is that when you come to buy those devices, they're considerably more money than you might have been expecting, because we've been putting in high-end enterprise equipment under the Connect the Classroom banner. And we naturally, in a primary school, perhaps wouldn't have bought that. So that's just something that we're going to have to try and factor in, whether we continue down the path with the DfE spec of switching and wireless equipment and carry on with your Cisco's, or we take a step back and replace the Connect the Classroom closer to 2030 with the more sustainable, I would say sustainable from a financial point of view, equipment, sort of Ubiquity, Unify or Zeisel, are brands that we've used in that kind of bubble. If you're not in a Stoke-on-Trent City School, you won't have benefited from any Connect the Classroom money, or not much, unless you were an RI school at the time, in which case we've got networks that are just sat there using really basic wireless and switching equipment that does need upgrading to sort of meet this standard by 2030. And again, something that we can, as E-Volve, work with you on from a hardware planning point of view. But what we have to factor in is that the guys that come on site are desktop technicians, so they're paid, their hourly rate is for them to come in and fix things that are broken during that week, help you plan forward for your hardware requirements. So for example, your laptops are 2 to 3 years old, when you think about replacing those in the next 18 to 24 months. At low level strategic planning, they're not necessarily either qualified or experienced enough, whichever provider you're using locally, to sort of delve into these wider strategic planning sessions. So we're building, so we've talked about broadband, we've talked about the core network in those network switches, and we've talked about the wireless, which enables you to connect back to that network. What we also have to do is think about the cybersecurity of all of that. So I've talked about network segregation, that's key. We've talked about not being able to just hop on the wireless and crack on. Cybersecurity covers, as far as I'm concerned, you could replace that word with safeguarding from an IT point of view. And so it requires that devices are kept up to date. How do we know that those devices are kept up to date? Well, we need some sort of management system for that. So, for example, a lot of schools that we support use Jamf for their iPads. So we can easily hop onto Jamf and check that those iPads have received their updates and hunt down any that are not updated. Less easy in a Windows environment. We've got legacy networks out there that may be 10, 15 years old from a design point of view, where devices aren't necessarily connected back to a central server or managed in a way that makes it easy to monitor those patches. And those devices also need locking down. So, for example, staff should not be able to go onto the internet and install a YouTube downloader. That was a historic one that was great fun and always caused us some trouble. That needs to run through an admin, some sort of process, whether that's somebody appointed in the school or whether that's somebody from your IT support company. Staff should not have the ability to install bits of software from the internet. And so we need to redesign some of these networks in a way that moving forward, they are more secure and more robust and protect the children in a better way. Now, it's not as scary as it sounds. Most or many schools still run with an on-site server, and those servers are going to become end of life. And when we're at that point, when we're having that conversation, we're recommending that people move to the cloud, and particularly Microsoft 365. So all your devices would link back to Microsoft 365 rather than your on-site server. And as we go through that project and that process of upgrading your networks and decommissioning those servers, you'll naturally tick many of these boxes for the cybersecurity. What we must factor into that is that what we must factor into the cybersecurity element of it is that the devices are locked down effectively, but making sure that the staff can still operate at a level that they're kind of familiar with, and backfill there with some training potentially, because I know a lot of schools can comply with training by just going onto the National Cybersecurity Centre and watching this about a 25-minute video, which ticks the box for your RPA insurance, but actually is a once a year activity. It means it's not front of mind. And actually, we typically see in the spring term quite a few increased calls around, oh, I've clicked a link in an email or we've had this problem. And it's because that refresher typically takes place on an inset day in September or towards the beginning of the year. And then people forget. So we have a bit of a spike in the spring. And then over the summer term, it calms down again a little bit because we've had that scare in the spring and we've had a bit of a reminder. So we need to think about training as a more robust system within our cybersecurity management. So those are the kind of key things really, the DfE. It's more robust cybersecurity, and I don't want to get into the technical too much, as well as training and management of that process to make sure that we've not got staff, students just randomly installing bits of software or accessing files and folders that they shouldn't do, and documenting those processes, which again, when you talk about on-site technicians and desktop support, is really difficult in 3.5 hours or 7.5 hours a week. It's not necessarily feasible. So we need to come up with a strategy as schools and trusts that can either offload some of that process or outsource some of that process, or buy in extra time really to sort of fulfill it. Yeah, thank you, DfE. So skipping on to the next sort of phase. So when we think about safeguarding and IT, we typically think about filtering and monitoring. Now, any school that we come in contact currently tick the box for filtering and monitoring. Could we do more? Yes. Would it be appropriate to do more? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. So you'll all have heard of products like Securus, Lightspeed, Securely, Senso. Those are typically monitoring packages. So they're installed on a device and they look at what the children are doing. They flag up reports to DSLs or somebody. There's a process internally that follows through with, and what we're finding is that they're not necessarily configured as efficiently as possible because they just get turned on day one and left to their own devices, which means somebody somewhere in an office is getting hundreds of alerts with random words or partial spellings of somebody's surname that might look like an inappropriate word. So we need to just review as those licenses come up for renewal. Have we got the right package, and can we bring in those providers to either deliver more training or help optimize their software in a more appropriate way? And the filtering element of that is going back to the first core standard, really, where your broadband comes into your building. We need to make sure that the inappropriate content, or as much as possible of that, gets blocked. But what we have to have as governors and leaders is a conversation around what is inappropriate and what is not inappropriate. So, for example, if you've got a year 6 class doing a sex education topic for a term, you might want to be able to loosen the filtering around that category for them for that half term, but keep it restricted for the rest of the school. And likewise, if you're in a high school environment, that could be even looser, more loose. Just need to make sure that filtering is appropriate. really. And when we think about monitoring, we need to think about when staff go home, both from a protecting the school's point of view, reputational damage point of view, but also protecting the staff. So there's that transparency. So all devices, staff, student, dinner lady, what should have some sort of monitoring and filtering in place, whether it's on or off site. So we need to review that by 2030, make sure that we're compliant with that. And then we need to, what we've talked about there, all those other 5 standards, is embed those as a strategic process, really, I guess. So you all do school development plans, you've all got risk registers. I've seen quite a few risk registers where ICT doesn't touch them, or it's only a very light touch thing. And actually, I think there's probably a few strands in there that could be embedded. And likewise, as a governor myself, I sort of get oversight into the school where I'm a governor of what's going on at a really high level without an awful lot of detail. And we don't necessarily get involved in the strategic side of things, which I think is what the DfE are alluding to here. With your governing boards, you've often got a lot of experience from people working in the private sector that can feed back into these processes and make your systems more robust. So we need a leader within the school, a senior leader appointed for digital leadership to drive these core standards, but also policy reviews, implementation of new technologies, and be that sort of source of knowledge when somebody comes with something new, or to keep their eye on new and emerging technologies to embed them into your school. AI is a great example here, where so many schools are just running off in many different directions with AI, and we've got no data impact assessments, no policies, no acceptable use policies. We've got students bringing in homework, doing whatever they want. And so we need to just take that step back, make sure we've got a good, robust policy in place. Now, there are some template policies available from the likes of the National College or Entrust. They just need tweaking appropriately to your setting. But again, that's not something that one of our on-site engineers, although they'll always say yes because they're so helpful, not always something that they can do. So I'm encouraging you really at this point, while I was thinking about digital leadership, to think about appointing someone in your school, talking to your governors a bit more about it, and providing them with some relevant data. Now, I can give you some examples of relevant data if you want to reach out after this, as well as a sample risk register that I've created just for IT. There's about 6 or 7 strands on there that could either feed into your main risk register or be an appendix of. Or if you sit and talk to your governors about that, you might want to discard them. And basically, we need to have that strategic oversight, as it says on the screen, as a school or trust, so that we're not just making things up as we go along. Hopefully, you found that useful. It's a really whistle-stop tour of the 6 standards, and I haven't wanted to go into too much technical detail because I've aimed this at leaders, not technical staff. But what we can offer is some support around assessment gap analysis. So I have got some tick sheets, and obviously if you're a client of ours for your IT support, we've got a good bit of in-depth knowledge around that. And we'll put a package together that is competitive and demonstrates good value, so that you can get a good baseline and where you need to work towards. And as always, we'll continue on that level of supporting the ongoing plans with hardware. So like I've already talked about, your laptops are 3 years old, your printers coming up to the end of its contract. We'll always support on that level and feed in where we can on the strategic level. But I do feel like what the DfE have launched here is something that's a bit more, and we're talking about head of IT type stuff, not desktop technician or IT technician role. So like I said, hopefully found that useful, and if I can be of any assistance, please just reach out and I'll have a conversation with you about it, and we'll come up with a plan. In the meantime, I'll share the recording of this webinar and a couple of templates that I've already mentioned, rather than you having to reach out about those. Thanks for your time. Quick question here, actually, from Becky. Yep, templates, and also from Kate. So absolutely, I'll send the templates out. No problem. There's no other questions popped into the chat. So I really appreciate you hopping on the call, and thanks for your time.